Hello, we are live. It is 7 o'clock right now in Brooklyn, USA. And in a few seconds, you may hear the sounds of my neighbors cheering and banging pots to thank the first responders who have been doing so much and deserve all the adulation that we can throw at them. That is the new normal as we sit here right now. Things are different, but as much as they are, some things are still the same. Thousands of you have crossed the doors at BRIC House, and tonight you're in your house, and so am I, and so are the people I'm going to introduce you to in just a moment. This is the BRIC BHeard Town Hall, The Foreseeable Future. We're going to be talking to some people who make it their business to project ourselves and our culture into the future, in some instances by 50 or 100 years. But right now, we're challenging them to live in the most provocative space of the future, the foreseeable future, the next 12 to 24 months as they will go down here in Brooklyn and around the world. So some of you may be wondering, just what is it that a futurist does? Well, one quick explanation that helped me to get to an understanding that I might be disabused of when we talk to some actual futurists tonight is this: a three-headed answer. So, historians are concerned with the study of the past. Journalists are making the reporting and showing us what's happening in the present. And futurists are people who are gathering information, analytics, and stories to tell us about where we may be going. To that service, we're going to get in some stories tonight, and we're also going to listen to some presentations by some folks that are frankly pretty smart on health, the economy as it pertains to jobs, education, infrastructure, and culture. It's a lot to talk about, and we're going to rock with you for an hour now, and I'd like to introduce you to the people who are going to be helping us. This is the foreseeable future. We're going to be talking with Greg Tate first, and Mr. Tate is joining us from Harlem. We're going to be talking with him about culture. Peter Bishop is joining us from California, where he'll be talking about education. Heather McGowan is coming to us from Massachusetts and will be informing us about the future of work. Dr. Jonathan Metzel is coming all the way from his kitchen in Brooklyn. All right, BK. And finally, Cindy Frewen is coming to us from Kansas City, and she's going to be speaking about infrastructure. So this is one part of the town in the town hall. The other part is, of course, you. So this is the moment when I'm going to encourage you to be in dialogue with us as if we were back in BRIC House and I was running around with the microphone, except this time you'll be able to type your questions and direct them at our presenters, who will be coming to us in 5-minute presentations that they pre-recorded earlier. And once those presentations are done, I'll have a little time with them before bringing everyone into the room for a large discussion with all of your questions throughout. So we're going to begin at the beginning with culture and a presentation by Greg Tate.
I guess the question before us is the future of culture, the Afro future of culture. I have a baseline definition of culture, which is simply what people do. From an anthropological perspective, that's what you're looking at. It's like, what have people been doing to define themselves in the world as a group, as a tribe, as a village, as a nation, as a block, as a neighborhood, as a corner. And I think that if we're looking at this, this whole question of post-pandemic, what is it going to become? I mean, that's an assumption that there is a post-pandemic that doesn't take into account, even if we're talking about a reduction in the number of infections and number of fatalities, we're going to be talking about the culture of grieving, the culture of mourning, of remembrance. Because here in New York, it's very interesting. You're very sensitive to the fact that you're living in a parallel universe, or in a place that has parallel universes. There's such wide discrepancy between how this pandemic is being experienced by those in shelter, those in quarantine, and then those who are on the medical front lines. And then there are the essential workers who have to put themselves forth into the world every day. In this situation where they're exposed to a very nasty, vicious, thirsty, hungry virus, they have to do the opposite in some cases of what everybody else is being told to do in terms of exposure to sociality. So you're also looking at there's a culture of PTSD, of trauma, that's going to be a part of what we do as a nation, as a village, as a tribe, as a corner in this, that has to be factored in. In terms of the expressive arts, we're slowly starting to see how people are using the mediums we have at hand. There's Zooms and Instagrams and Snapchats and Twitches and so forth. D Nice has brought to us this whole notion of club quarantine, which is turned into like quite a global club. It's quite a rave online, and so people have shown that the technology and the degree to which it allows a certain amount of call and response and interactivity is bringing a whole new notion of club into the crib, into the quarantine sheltered domicile, and this capacity people have to kind of share themselves experiencing this kind of global group rave moment, says something about our adaptability to these new circumstances, So, and, it's like when we talk post-pandemic, there's just so many levels to that, because it makes assumptions about testing and tracing and the organized, sane or rational government response in different places in the world, right? And in America, it's just so disturbing that there's so much denial going on. At the same time, it's like bodies are like, piling up in the hospitals, and the mortuaries and the mass graves out there on Hunt's Island, and the numbers that people know from other parts of the world, but there's a thing we call American exceptionalism. I call it American self-deceptionalism, where there's such a bubble of privilege and entitlement and kind of feigned innocence around what's going on anywhere outside of people's immediate circumference. And so you have this pandemic, which is moving in the areas, it's kind of slouching towards, the Midwest and, the cornfield states, of America. And that's changing, this culture of denial, this culture of deceptionalism as well. So, all these things are on deck as we move forward. But I feel at the same time that what artists are going to do with their empathic capacities and their prophetic, generative, expressive capacities is give us a sense of how magnificent human beings can be when they share their gifts for saying what can't be said through ideology, what can't be said through journalism, when they use their psychic telepathic abilities to kind of reach us on these deeper inner spiritual levels, so that we're really in touch with, our most kind of enlightened and cosmically and socially connected selves.
All right, we're back. That was Greg Tate, the renowned cultural critic, producer, musician, and authorian on the Afrofuture and Afrofuturism. So knowing all of that and what you're bringing in the perspective, Greg, I'm wondering how the future of right now and the foreseeable future, especially for folks of color, may intersect with the notions that we've all developed about Afrofuturism.
Well, I think that I've been thinking a lot about Black people's powers of invention and reinvention, and this whole the whole place of conjuration in the culture, of bringing together one's expressive capacities, one's pursuit of magic in execution, in expression, to really elevate your community, your audience, your spectators, and I think everyone is caught in a kind of limbo or kind of lurch, trying to figure out, well, how do I take this gift that I have that is so much defined by how I interact with folks in social space, or how they interact with the work. What in the foreseeable future can be an altered, adapted platform that has the same kind of efficacy, the same ability to create call and response, the same ability to do what, we see D Nice doing. How do you translate that to other mediums, while we're all in this purgatory? And I'm pretty confident, given the astronomical degree of creativity there is in this city in particular, that we're going to see some very novel responses to the time of pandemic, that kind of perform in-runs around kind of the sterility of our teleconferencing.
Well, to that end, I just today on the news, I just saw some artists who are going around and writing graffiti that is artwork, aerosol art, not like the bad old days that some might think of, on these
writing as we call it.
The color and the art lives in New York, even if we're confronted with plywood. Thank you for bringing that perspective. I can't wait to see you in concert with the folks who we're going to meet just now, but we definitely appreciate you, Mr. Tate, and stick around for our question and answer. And I want to encourage everyone who's watching right now that you can get in on the discussion a la our old town halls by going to the YouTube channel and submitting a question. And I'm going to be looking at those and asking them all night as we move on. So I'm going to pivot right now. Greg was talking about the interconnectedness and the layers of culture in the city and the ways that we're going to interact. And that blends beautifully into the next person I'm going to introduce you to. Dr. Cindy Frewen is a futurist as well as an architect, and she teaches the Designs Future Workshop and Social Change at the University of Houston. She's also a primary in her own architectural firm and provides some strategic foresight. So Dr. Frewen, thank you for joining us tonight. And now we're going to hear her presentation on infrastructure.
So when it comes to long-term thinking about cities, we actually have to divide it up in a couple of different eras. And what we call those is three horizons. And these are three different kinds of scenarios, three different ways of thinking about the future. The first one that I think about is the longest term, and that's sort of the blue skies, and it's called the third horizon. Then there's today's thinking, and that is the first horizon. That's what we're doing to make, ends meet, what we're doing to survive today. And with COVID, that's been totally disrupted. In between is the second horizon, which are the strategists, the ideas that link and bridge the first and the third horizon. During the concept of a pandemic, we actually are transforming the future, and we just don't know it. Healthcare, we've been talking about economics. Today, I'm thinking about cities, and they are accumulation of all of those different things. That creates a system. A system means that there's interlocking dynamic parts, and when there's interlocking dynamic parts, change is not on a linear, change is emergent, and it comes about in ways that are unexpected and unpredictable, and most importantly, uncertain. Innovation doesn't happen in a vacuum. Maybe we're sheltering at home, but we're more connected than ever in many ways. So you have to look at both the good side and the bad side. And one of the good things has been this slowing down, getting in touch with our families, getting in touch with our neighbors, people that are near us. And some places have allowed that, have enabled it better than others. Cities change really slowly. I have to say, even if you're thinking about immediate plans, that can take 25 years to actually come to fruition. It takes a long time for a building cycle. And so I like to think in terms of a 50 and 100-year plan. The long view gives you a chance to incorporate a lot of different possibilities. The digital, the AI futures have sped up. Technology has sped up tremendously. So how can you change your lifestyle to use the screens? In fact, I'd say my safest mask, and yours too, is this screen. I don't have to wear a mask at this time. This is the safest place for me to be. How can the city be automated? Think about how it's getting automated. I've seen pictures of people that of senior living facilities in Belgium where they have little robots with the iPads on the face of them, and it's the family on the iPad being sent around the visiting with the person that lives there. How do you get in touch? How do you use the screens to get in touch with people? We'll use that innovation to create a new future. It's very possible that there's a number of facilities that are going to be empty after this. How do those get reused? Are they just going to be these 70-story vacant buildings? Or are you going to be looking at, and as the warehouses have been and now become housing, what are you going to do with the buildings that end up no longer being useful the way they were? I really believe that we have had industrialized cities forced upon us that we do not need anymore. And this is an opportunity that we rethink how they work in order to make it more functional and less of a stress on our lives. Industrial era is that we use things for consumption. This has been an era of consumption. And in fact, you can change that around for production. How do you make your life into a place that's producing? Whether it's food or things? You've seen it with the masks. How can you make a place that's more environmentally conscious, whether that's energy or saving water or using rainwater and becoming more of a producer than a consumer? How do you make community spaces more safe and more useful and more beautiful? The parks, the sidewalks, the streets. These workplaces. Think about whether or not you really need to be in the workplace, or how can you share without contaminating? We've had online doctor's appointments. We're having curbside doctor's appointments. What if waiting rooms end up being in your vehicle or at the bus stop? What if in fact you're no longer going inside the waiting rooms because they're no longer safe? What are we wearing? That's the next level that you're reaching out. What are our houses like? What are our neighborhoods like? What are our cities like? And finally, what is your position in the online global world? Because in fact, as everybody's been going online, you have an opportunity. There's many opportunities for new voices and new people to emerge. And that's what's happened. Leadership and vision create change in cities. If we in fact are full of urgency, but it's urgency for today, but instead we parlay it into urgency for long term. So in fact, it's purposeful action. The things that we're doing are purposeful. Then you have a message, then you have a place at the table, and that's how you create new voices.
So I'm back, and we're welcoming Dr. Cindy Frewen into the room all the way from Kansas City. So we have an interesting question about infrastructure and looking at the ways that we may ourselves come back. If New York City is really defined in a lot of ways by the concentration of its people and its street life. Is there a way that the city is going to come back in a way that is open and not going to be resistant to a change in culture, Doctor? Looking at the way that New York is so concentrated and people are thick, what's the quickest way to build ourselves back into society?
I think what you're asking is, will our cities fit this new way of a safer but still connected world? And how do we feel comfortable and safe enough to go out into the world without rebuilding everything? And the first line of defense has got to be science. I have great faith that they will cure this with a vaccine, but we do have a 2 to 3 or even 5 year period that the city itself, or our lifestyles, our choices, our behavior make a difference. So New York is so dense, and some people like to say, well, that's just not going to work anymore, it's not safe. I would disagree, because I think we have to learn, and children are better at learning this than adults, certainly older adults are better. They're better at immediately saying, hey, don't go close to each other. They're better at saying, we have to stay apart like this, and they'll correct us. And that means that we have to learn new behaviors, and because people do desire social lives, and we desire being near each other, and we do better when we're near each other. We are more creative when there's a density. We are more innovative. We do more things. We have more, to use the term magic, we have a better society because we're closer together. In most cases, of course, there's a downside of that as well. But I think that we're going to have to readjust because of it. And there's so much unused space in the city. I believe that we can still do it. We for every place that we are sitting, there's probably 7 or 10 other places that we could be that are empty while we're sitting here. And so if we can just resort how we're using everything, then things will start to make sense again and still be safe.
Safe and working. Thank you for that. We'll be speaking with you very soon. And now, Dr. Jonathan Metzl from Vanderbilt University on the future of healthcare.
Hello, Brooklyn. I'm Jonathan Metzl. I'm the director of the Center for Medicine, Health, and Society at Vanderbilt University, and also, believe it or not, a Brooklyn resident. I've been through the pandemic here in Clinton Hill, and like everyone, the idea of imagining a future that is beyond the pandemic sounds great, because then we can imagine what's coming next. I'm a doctor and a sociologist, and my work looks at race and infrastructure and healthcare, and I've really been thinking a lot over the course of this pandemic about the problems that got us into this horrible situation and about how things can change when we come out of it. I think one of the main issues, of course, is that all of the countries in the world right now are facing the same problem, this same coronavirus. And it's been interesting for me to look around the world at the ways that different societies deal with this, and the ways that some societies do better and others do worse. I will say that one of the most important factors is a functioning healthcare system, right? People have access to healthcare, people have access to treatment, and that it's an equitable healthcare system. So it's not just that wealthy people can get to the doctor, but other people can't. So number one is I'm hoping that we can learn that lesson. I know that that's been in the air, questions of Medicare for all and other factors like that, whatever you want to call it. But I would say that this pandemic has highlighted the profound inequality of access to healthcare that really is a risk factor, just like the virus itself. So number one is that I hope we come out of this with a much more equitable healthcare system. I think we see the downside of not doing that, which is not only, of course, the very disparate rates of illness and death that we have right now in this country. Minoritized populations, low-income populations are dramatically more at risk. And so I just think that that is an unsustainable system, an unsustainable framework for our country. And so, first of all, I hope we come out of this with a much more equitable healthcare system. The second part that I think we've recognized, again, given the profoundly incommensurate rates of death in particularly African-American and Latinx populations, is that this illness is not just a medical illness, it's also a social illness. It's also a political illness, because the people who are at risk now, it's not like they're biologically at risk. It's not like there's some kind of genetic reason they're at risk. They're at risk because they live in an insecure housing situation, or a very dense housing situation. They have jobs where they have to go out and put themselves at risk being in particular kinds of jobs. They live in neighborhoods that have infrastructure that has not been adequately taken care of. And so I think the other issue is we've got to fix these kind of social inequities in this country. And of course that is horrific and deadly for people who live in low income areas. As we're seeing here, the virus really preys on social infrastructure that has not been taken care of. And I think we need a dramatic national effort to address that infrastructure. But also, look at this virus, look at this pandemic. The virus keeps spreading until we put it out in everybody, right? And so it's also important for the country that we address these social inequities. So number two is to address the underlying social issues. And of course, we've seen that particularly in places like Brooklyn, where the people who were already at risk before the virus become more at risk afterwards. And number three, I think one great thing about New York is solidarity. And I think part of achieving the first 2 points is linked to point number three, which is, I think, the solidarity that this city has shown in many ways compared to other parts of the country has been remarkable in some ways. And I think that in a way, what can we do to encourage solidarity among people, between networks? And I'm hoping that will be one of the resonant points from this pandemic, because I think what we've realized is, believe it or not, and this is a wake-up call for a lot of people to show just how interconnected that we all are. We're all in the same networks, even though there, of course, are a lot of economic disparities that need to be addressed. But public transportation and food delivery networks, things people never thought about before. So I think what can we do to bolster solidarity would be I think another important factor. I think information going forward is going to need to be reconfigured. I just personally think, I'm somebody who studies race, and I feel like dismayed that the voices of medical authority, of public health authority, which have their own problematic histories of race and racism in this country. But at a time like this, there's such a hunger for just what's the right information, what's the right treatment, what's the right practice. Should I stand 6 feet away from somebody? Should I wear a mask? And I feel like those messages have been so easily co-opted by divisive messages. And so I think that in a way, fixing the kind of information infrastructure, creating ways that information is democratic, particularly health information, fixing the ways that the voices of communities can be heard, and that there can be kind of a more democratic way to get out trusted information, not just about health and illness, but also about the structural factors that I was talking about earlier. I guess just as a doctor, the last point I would say is that I think that there really needs to be a reckoning about race and racism in medicine. I think this two-tiered healthcare system that we have is a result of misplaced values in the healthcare system itself. And so really bringing to bear all the great anti-racist work that's been done by Ibram Kendi and other people, or people who critique what sociologists call kind of racial capitalism, really thinking very hard about what would it mean to have a truly racially equitable healthcare system, public health system. I think that would be an important move, for an important stance for medicine, just given, again, the disparate rates of death that have happened here, and really what those reflect about the society that we've created. I think, maybe that sounds pie in the sky, but I would say that I've been, believe it or not, I mean, we've been doing these webinars here from Brooklyn about what's called structural competency, this new way that we can bring medicine together with public health, with critical race studies. And we've had thousands of people show up, doctors, nurses, healthcare workers from across the world, really, because I think medical workers are tired of this system as well. And so I do see that from this moment of pain, from this moment of despair, there really is a possibility for recreating change. I guess finally, I'll say that there are a lot of just practical matters, that would be involved in creating structural change that's more equitable. Think about, for example, telemedicine right now, this idea that we're going to be seeing our doctors over the internet. Well, everybody needs the internet in that case. Food distribution, some communities are really struggling to get food more than others. How can we fix the food networks, access to pharmaceuticals, things like that? So I would hope that what we come out of this is a much more resilient system, and one that doesn't leave us quite as vulnerable. And finally, just a note of thanks to everyone in my community here in Brooklyn and in Brooklyn more broadly. The power of feeling everyone kind of going through this together in different ways has been, I think, one of the more empowering aspects of this horrible pandemic.
A lot to digest there, Dr. Metzel, and we're going to mix it up. Some great questions came in during your presentation, but just in the spirit of moving things along, I'm going to ask you a yes or no question as we're halfway through our time right now on the foreseeable future. So I want to ask, in that spirit of solidarity that you spoke about, do you think that this pandemic is the moment where this is going to be the before and after, where folks do come together? Short answer.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. We'll digest a little more later. But right now, we're going to move to something that is very foremost in a lot of people's minds right now, as we're a few weeks away from the first of the month, the future of work. Heather McGowan is one of the foremost experts on the future of work and where it is that we're going, and she prepared this presentation.
Hi, my name is Heather McGowan. I'm going to give you a quick overview of how I see the future of work. So how I see the future of work, I've really codified in this book that recently came out with my co-author Chris Shipley called The Adaptation Advantage, which Thomas Friedman from the New York Times generously wrote the foreword for us. It's about how we need to adapt continuously to rapid change, of which the virus is one. So we are having the greatest leaps in human longevity at the same time that we're having the greatest velocity of change, primarily driven by technology. So for example, if you were born back when the steam engine came out, life expectancy was 37. So you had 2.5 generations to absorb the impact of that paradigm shifting change. Fast forward to today, life expectancy closer to 90, 2, 3, 4, 5 different paradigm shifts within a single generation, depending on your age. We're not prepared for that. This velocity of technology-driven change is accelerating, whereas it's meeting this tension with human adaptation, which has long been linear and at a slower pace. Although a couple of months ago, something came into play, the coronavirus, which I think is actually an accelerant to our digital transformation, which is really human transformation. And if you zoom in on that, it's really only been 57 days since the World Health Organization declared it a global pandemic. And in that 57 days, and in fact, really in the first 2 weeks, we've made dramatic changes about how we work, where we work, who works, and what we do. The World Health Organization declared it a global pandemic on March 11th. So on March 10th, we've moved from as many people working from home as possible, which could be anywhere from 29% to 30% of our workforce. Work becomes dangerous for people for whom it wasn't dangerous before. Restaurant workers, healthcare workers, grocery store workers, and delivery drivers now put their life in their hands, bus drivers. Companies have rapidly pivoted what they do, product lines, from alcohol and perfumes to hand sanitizer, from fashion to personal protective equipment, from cars to ventilators. We have reworked processes, remapped supply chains. Any parent out there, my God, you're now a full-time teacher. That is a tremendous amount of work. And leaders out there managing teams now have established trust and psychological safety for their teams to be successful working remotely. And visionary CEOs who are heads of companies that for one reason or another can't operate their business right now have said, wait a second, what are we good at and where's the need and how quickly can we pivot? That is a tremendous amount of adaptation in a very, very short period of time. And what we're coming out of is what I call the old promise, where education, career, and retire existed in discrete bands. Whether you went to university or not, it was the first third of your life, sufficient only to get you on the career ladder, collect a pension, and by design die a year later. Success measures here to be codify and transfer the right predetermined skills and existing knowledge in you to get you on that escalator. Now it looks more like this. Life expectancy may not be 90 yet, but it will be soon. Education becomes learning to imply there's no end state to that. Work becomes leverage of that learning to indicate that work and learning are a combined act. And longevity becomes a reality because we didn't plan for or save for, nor can we afford cognitively or financially a 30-year retirement. And it looks more like this. There's a relationship between our engagements, which could be all within a job, but they're tours of duty where we work on projects over periods of time that integrate learning and leveraging together, remain engaged, and our success measures there are, can we learn, adapt, and create new value continuously? Because I say in the past, we learned once in order to work. Now we work in order to continuously learn. In the past, our identity was bestowed upon us, externally validated, whether it was your trade union, your degree, your title, your company. Some of those things can be taken away from you, where there's more resilience and agility in a self-actualized, internally validated identity connected to your purpose. Because where we are today is we're standing on the edge of a raging river. We've been wandering down a path. It's been great for some, not great for others, but on the edge of the river, this lays bare our inequities of society. And we need to cross this river, but all we can see are the swirling eddies that we think might kill us. And what we fail to see is on the other side of the river, the grass may be greener, the paths may be better. Not only that, we've already started this process of crossing the river. We've flattened the curves. We have adapted rapidly, as I mentioned in the beginning, to different types of where we work and how we work and who works. And we're going to get to the other side where I think things might just be better. So that's how I see the future work in about 5 minutes. And I look forward to having a discussion with you so we can expand on these topics and well as others. Again, my name's Heather McGowan, and that's my quick synopsis on the future work. Thanks.
And Heather McGowan is with us right now. I'm going to also be very unfair to you and ask you a short question. Some economists have estimated that New York City is set to lose about 1.2 million jobs by the end of this month. Most of them what they classify as low-wage jobs in restaurants, retail, or transportation. How many of those jobs, of the 1.2 million, do you think are going to be lost to the old world versus post-COVID-19?
I have no way of knowing. I don't have a crystal ball, but I am encouraged by the fact that we're no longer calling those low-wage, low-skill jobs, and we're calling them frontline workers and essential workers. I think the virus may very well change our settlement patterns. It's certainly going to change what work looks like, and we need a massive reskilling and upskilling so more people can find meaningful work that aligns with their purpose.
Asked and answered. Thank you so much for that, and we'll be talking to you shortly. Sure. Appreciate the emphasis on work in that shifting landscape. And now for our final presentation, here is Dr. Peter Bishop on the future of education.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be with you here in the BRIC TV Town Hall in our virtual environment. Not exactly town halls the way we used to have them, but we're learning as we go. My name is Peter Bishop, and I'm a futurist. The title of this is The Foreseeable Future. And as a futurist, I have to tell you that we don't really do predictions about what's foreseeable. We do scenarios because we believe that the future, particularly the long-term future, and indeed the future we're dealing with right now, is highly uncertain. And therefore to say what will happen would be, we believe, incorrect. And therefore I'm going to talk a little bit about what could happen or what might happen. We've got two, we call these dimensions of uncertainty, and I'll just focus on two because we have a short period of time. First of all, how big will this change be? Will we snap back to education as it was before, or will we actually transform education to a new normal something that we have never seen before? That's one big question, and we don't know the answer to that. Is it possible to believe in a snapback given the size of this disruption? Well, it's happened before. The most recent one was the 2009 recession. We thought it was the biggest, and it was the biggest downturn in the economy since the Great Depression almost 100 years ago. And yet things returned after a while, and it took some time, but things pretty much returned to normal. And in the last few years before the virus, we had a bigger economy almost than ever before. And so snapback is a definite scenario. It could go back to the way things used to be before. The opposite side, of course, is that this is a transformative event, that this event will change education and enter into a new era, an era that we've not seen before. We hope that may happen because there's a lot of things about the old education system that we didn't particularly like. There was a lot we did like, certainly familiar. We knew how to do it, but we're learning new things. And has that happened before? Well, of course. The biggest example, of course, is the internet, which comes along in the 1990s, does arrive slowly. It wasn't this sudden, but of course, it's a disruption in communication and almost everything we do in education, in life, and business, that has transformed everything. So could we have a transformation after this disruption? Absolutely. So the way we think of this as a futurist as a continuum, snap back to exactly what it was before? Probably not. Transform to the utopian future of what we all wish it were? Well, probably not that either. Somewhere in between is where the foreseeable future for education is, but we don't know where exactly that in between is. How much snapback, how much transformation. The other big question is whether we like what will occur and be permanently established if there is this new era. Obviously, it could be worse. In other words, we could have an education system that has downsides, in which students who have been out of school for so long, particularly students who need pretty much teacher contact, a lot of teacher contact, they may get behind in their studies and therefore not do as well. School districts which are dependent on state sales tax or property values may see a diminution in their funds, in their resources, and they will have to cut back a great deal as well. And finally, we have the fact that educators themselves might be basically so disrupted by this is that they snap back they basically recreate the old system. And that is not exactly what we're talking about. Could there be something better? Well, the better may actually be solving some of those conditions and those issues that we really didn't like much before. How disengaged, particularly high school and college undergraduates were in their studies. How much college students were paying for their college education. And the fact that teachers were still relying largely on textbooks, trying to get across content, information, which now is almost immediately accessible on their smartphones. So how do we summarize these? Well, talking about snapback and the downsides, we know that already. We don't really have to talk about it much. But I think there are two things that are going on today, more or less by requirement, that could change education. The first, of course, is a much greater use of technology. Fundamentally, the only way that teachers and students can interact these days is through technology, whether through Zoom or Google Docs or Google Spreadsheets or however they choose to do it. Now we have required for at least the rest of this school year and maybe next, a mediated form of communication. That I think will force some teachers to reassess how they've used technology in the past. There may be some advantages to mediated communication that they didn't see before. I had a colleague who did her dissertation research on something she called the CAP gap. CAP, K-A-P, knowledge, attitude, performance. She did a survey of community college instructors and asked them how much they knew about information technology in the classroom. Oh, a lot. What did they think of it? Great deal, it's great. How much did they do? Not much at all. A lot of knowledge, a lot of attitude, not much performance. And now we have some more performance. So we could see more and better use of technology in education in the future. The other thing that's required students to do and teachers to allow to happen is more independent learning. Students can't be in touch with a teacher 50 minutes a day. Some are doing very well with that, being more creative, learning on their own, and some obviously not so good. The future, foreseeable future, is that maybe we realize that education is not so much like building a building where you have to do everything. You have to nail all the boards together, mix the concrete and lay it down, put up the walls and the roof, and everything has to be done. It's maybe more like growing a garden or even raising a child, where there is among young people and the rest of us an intrinsic capacity and a desire to learn. The teacher's job, therefore, is not to pour the material into the student's head, but to set up the conditions, like the garden. Once the conditions are set, then learning takes place and the flowers bloom. That would be both of those, I think, very interesting and basically beneficial uses in the future of education. These things are not going to happen by themselves, however. If we are to move in those directions, people who realize the benefits of a good and effective use of technology and giving students more freedom and more ability to create and to create their own learning are two outcomes of this future, preferred future, the semi-utopian future. Is it foreseeable? Well, of course it is, but so are some of the other scenarios. So keep talking about the scenarios, keep talking about stories, keep telling stories, both downsides and upside stories about what might occur. And I look forward to the discussion in the town hall following this presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
So you won't have to wait very long. I'm going to invite each of our panelists to turn on their cameras right now, and let's engage as a community. There was some questions that were pouring in as each of you were, your presentations were being shown. And there was one that is so applicable because there's so many intersections between each of your respective fields and presentations that I wanted to pose to all of you. How can we reach across the, quote, bubbles of privilege to combat structural disparities? And we've seen those disparities come into play with the way we work and the shifting of the language to recognize those folks on the front lines of work. We've seen it come to play in education. We've certainly seen it come to play in terms of health disparities and the built environment. So do I have any takers for how we might be able to reach across that bubble of privilege to really make those changes for the world we want to see post-COVID?
Well, you know, one area we didn't talk about was the future of governance, you know, particularly when we're looking at the most massive collapse, you know, of competent leadership, you know, in managing a crisis that I've probably seen in my lifetime, you know, because of how the way in which our politics now has just degenerated the capacity for coordination, for coherence. And in its place, we get this chaos and helter-skelter and kind of people left randomly to the devices of the competence or incompetence of their local or state governance, right? And and I think it's a very difficult. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just thinking, regardless of what your political affiliation or what you think of the respective leadership, wherever you may be, from each of your perspectives, looking at the very near future and further out into that 100, 200-year era span, how much does leadership matter?
Well, governance matters, right? Because you're looking at situations where, with the stroke of a pen, the dispensation of human rights and of resources and of wealth redistribution can break down along these kind of toxic partisan lines. Like the people who are the least equipped, the least educated, the least capable of guiding a nation through this crisis are really the ones who have their hands on the wheel, you know? So, and I don't think we figured out a way to address that yet.
I'm thinking Heather and Cindy, looking at the way that we look at the environment right now, and you're talking about infrastructure projects that may take a generation to come to fruition, or these changes that have been accelerated by this virus, does the person who's leading right now for this blip of time matter, looking at those long range things?
I think some of it is when that blip ends, which I hope is soon, like November. Let's be honest. But I think one of the things when it comes to work and more inclusion and more human potential is we've got to move education from being a weight to propellant. We have made education a for-profit business in this country, much like healthcare, to our detriment.
And Cindy, I know you are very concerned with the infrastructure and the built environment, and you said the culture changes before the buildings adapt to us.
So there's really a couple of levels. One is the system level. How do you make change initially? And that has to do with then leadership and getting people together to find the systems level changes that can be made. At the same time, during the conversation of figuring out what to do, that the conversation involves beliefs and values and where there's common ground, where things can be changed in multiple domains simultaneously. That's how you make a system change, is that instead of one big home run, it's a lot of different things on a lot of different levels. And the only way to do that, as you said, is through the leadership and what are the stories that are being told? What are the beliefs that are being impacted? What are the ways that people will change their minds through into a whole new paradigm, into a new shift? I think that you start with the leadership, and the leadership now has been, let's say, confusing at best. And that means that there has been this war almost among the various states and various leaders across domains. How does that instead be put into a cooperative spirit, a spirit of belief that we can find something better out of this? Because there was, in every other case, I can almost think of when we said we had an opportunity for transformational change, in recent years, we haven't been taking it. And that requires this vision, this urgency, which is already built in, and the leadership coming together.
So Dr. Bishop and Heather, this is sort of a double-headed question that came in from someone saying, if presumably this distance education and online and homeschooling is going to be our new normal for the foreseeable future, what kind of ways will work and society have to adapt for folks who have to make money and educating their children and homeschooling?
I think we might have to look at jobs having, flexibility in terms of hours. Like you may be working in the morning for your company, in the afternoon you might be teaching your kids. You might be working early evening for your company, but your company has to understand that your family comes first. And I think that we can get, if we don't have commuting hours, and if we focus on the things that really need to get done, we might be able to get them all in there. But I think back on your point before that about leadership, one of our biggest problems in this country has been a me-we problem. In September, October, you might not have cared if your Uber driver had health insurance or paid sick leave. But in May, you sure do, because their health is your health. And the more we can see the interconnectedness of each other, we might make better me-we decisions. We've got a leader right now who sees the world as a zero-sum game, and he's only winning if somebody else is losing. And that is faulty logic, and we need to get more people to understand that. Like talking about the infrastructure projects being a bunch of small little wins, they all begin with leadership and painting a picture of a world that doesn't exist yet, that has a place for all of us, where we is stronger than any of the individual me perspectives.
Yeah, Brian, the phrase that comes to mind is from John Gardner from the mid 20th century, who said, we are the people we've been waiting for. We really can't wait for some savior, some person to come in or leader to come in. Leaders are absolutely important, but so is everybody else. And what I think of right now is more about community. I don't think Heather's right. I mean, our leadership, particularly in Washington, is all about ourselves, but that's also cultural. They were not elected by a bolt out of lightning. It's that our society has become atomized into a sense of individuals. And that I hear people inching towards a little bit better sense of community. And I think mask wearing is an interesting signal of that culturally, Gregory, that I'm not wearing the mask for me, I'm wearing it for you. I'm signaling that I care about myself, but I also care about you. And if we could approach our schools, our cities, our infrastructure, our healthcare, more as a sense of we are in this together. We are not completely atomized, single, competitive individuals. And we have to simply not be charged, which none of us are, but start acting that way and start electing people and start participating where we can. And I think local politics and state politics is probably the place to start there.
You know,
And with the stories
real
we
quick?
tell.
No.
Dr. Metzel.
Say again.
Well, I would just say that, you know, I agree with everybody that the system we have now is unsustainable. I mean, yesterday, you know, in Chicago, they tried to open a Ford automotive plant, and it was a big reopening, and it stayed open for one day, and then turned out they didn't protect the workers, and the plant had to close again. So the model of kind of thinking about this two-tiered health network and not protecting everyone adequately, it's just not sustainable. It's not going to work in this model. And so this idea of choosing between health and the economy is, you know, you need efficient public health for everyone in order to sustain the economy. And I think that the societies that figure that out are going to come out of this the best in the long run. I think the idea of just throwing people back out there as fodder is not going to work. And so I ultimately think, you know, Trump, among all the failings, is promoting this idea that it's either the economy or health. And I think it's really that binary that is so false, and one that we have to reject, because if we don't start protecting everybody's public health, we're not going to have an economy, really.
And can I also point out that our education system fosters binary thinking? It fosters right answers. It fosters here's the solution, the only solution, the right solution. Well, I wish we could educate students on uncertainty and trade-offs and gray areas, and where there are multiple answers and multiple solutions. Some may be better than others, but learn to distinguish those. That would be my utopia for education, is that we put the uncertainties we're feeling right now at the core of the education, and the skills necessary to deal with complexity and uncertainty at the core of education, much more than the facts that we're trying to pour into those students' heads.
Well,
So
and that's really the heart of complexity.
Thank you, Cindy. I just wanted to let folks know that we are right up against the end of our broadcast hour. We charge you each with a Herculean task to leverage your thinking and expertise into what may happen in the foreseeable future. And we thank you for the time that you dedicated to this. I also want to let any of you watching know that we are going to be continuing these conversations on a one-to-one level with futurists, as well as community members who are actively working in the spaces that each of these people represent, from infrastructure to education and healthcare. So we're going to say goodnight for now, but we do thank you for tuning in, and we thank you for the time that you've spent with us. And we can't wait to be back in the room with you, meeting the way that we're used to, with all of the caution and all of the concern. So until that moment, continue to be engaged, continue to be in touch with us, and trust us to tell your stories, because we'll be here to share them. So thank you and good night, and we'll see you very soon. Bye now.
Take care. Bye.
But if there is anything that you would like included for this post, or if there's a point that you would like to make, we will do our best to bring it in and edit it.
Let me just thank you, Brian, and your crew for allowing us to participate in your first experiment. As Heather pointed out, we're all adapting, and you're adapting as well. Y'all did a great job.
You made it very easy, even for those of us that were resistant, let's say.
Well, experiment it was, but like you were all better than we deserve. Thank you so much for participating. It was the most unfair experience ever. But while I have you on, and you can just, if you have a moment, I just want to get to a specific question that folks asked, so we could include? Do you guys have a moment?
Sure.
Sure.
Let's
Okay,
go.
I realize that I'm on borrowed time now. Yes, let's go,
No
Cindy.
problem.
So team, let's get the gate cleared so I can ask this and we can take it full. Are you all with me technically? In my ear, Bricksters? Okay, so one question is, what type of technological businesses, startups, and humanitarian projects will be needed for Black communities now and in the next 3 to 5 years?
Independent healthcare services, without question. A community organized healthcare services and institutions to be those first responders when the next crisis of this sort emerges, because I think that out of this has certainly come a heightened sense of the Black communities, Latino communities' vulnerability, and also their sense of being disposable, not only as populations, but as workers. I mean, we saw that from the medical workers crying for resources from government. The correction officers who are working in the prison system, I mean, have really been just smashed, by the way that they've been treated as not essential but disposable workers, as in the way that those under their charge have. They've both kind of suffered being locked into not a quarantine, but a kind of hotbed of infection with no relief coming. I think the union of the CEOs had to sue the city, to get medical resources and protocols put in place. So these are things to be very aware of going forward. It's like, how does the community ready itself for the next hit?
I would add to that two things, which is one about democratizing health information. It's been far too easy for all the health messages to be co-opted or overcome, and so partially it's about how can health messaging be put forth in conversation between communities of color and medicine in a way that helps everybody have a voice and everybody spread the word. And the other is access to financial information. In other words, there are financial levers and tools that are largely only available to wealthy people about protecting your financial future. And I think that technologies that help communities of color, stay alive financially, I think are going to be equally as important.
I think there has to be some of this is at the community level where you help people coordinate. But from an infrastructure side, there are a lot of things about these buildings that need work. Now, are there so many construction workers that are going to be out of jobs because of other jobs that don't happen? Well, there's a lot of retrofitting that people are going to be needing to do, and they have been doing, but that it's going to be a combination on every level of what is it we need to be doing, the planning, programming side, what are the designs of it, and then what's the construction of it, and then how do you use it? And it's not just about the infrastructure that you see, but it's also the virtual combined with the actual space. Because the more there is virtual, the more lightweight and safe that you get. You'll be able to vary it more quickly. There needs to be the adaptability that you get with a virtual community, so you have to blend. It's a hybrid. So there might be even the guide for how you create these hybrids between a virtual and a real community.
I go back to the concept of community again, Brian, that we used to call them community schools, and we don't quite anymore. We have a very decentralized school system, which can be an advantage in the United States, but the schools themselves have walled themselves off, and I can speak that as an educator. They don't really want input from the community, and parents and businesses oftentimes basically turn over the function to the professional educators. And I think they're doing as good a job as they could, but there needs to be a communication and a dialogue and a collaboration. I mean, we're raising our children, not just your own children, but we're raising everybody's children in the community. So getting the schools to be able to listen and the community to be able to speak, effectively, and not just complaining in town halls or whatever, but really saying, what can we do to create a learning environment that helps all of our children become better? That's the educator's response to that. And all these other responses, absolutely necessary as we're talking.
So there's one thing that came up that was really interesting from one of our colleagues, actually, about the future of public spaces, saying that just public space is such an important vector of civic power and historically have been really hard to replicate online. So how do you think that we are going to move forward, and what resources are out there to support that kind of community?
You know, I thought Congress did a really poor job of adapting to this when I was looking at it visually, that if they were taking our public spaces and creating the vacancy, it looked vacant, it looked underused. Instead, it has to look like a space that is being used in a new and different way. And so those are of course very elite public spaces. There's also the parks and playgrounds that have caused a lot of controversy because how are people going to do that while they can't be next to each other? And you can see that some places were more creative than others and made it a new experience. Like I saw greenhouses going up, basically transparent boxes that created spaces for a whole family or a whole group to get together, but that they were then cordoned off from other people without feeling like they were
Alone together.
It was odd, you know, it was actually a new special kind of event for them. You have to rethink in a very different way, than what it was. So how do you do that virtually? For me, anyway, it's never going to be just sitting at home or just being out in public. More and more, it's going to be together, augmented reality, things that are mixed together at the same time. And then that's a new magical benefit. Then you get a benefit of each. Because, you know, just sitting at home is pretty harsh. You have to admit, you can do it for a long time, but at some point you say, you know, I really miss people. And how can I do that safely? And it's we're going to see that more and more. How do we do that safely? This is the safest way, but it's not the same. And I would be so sad if a whole nother generation never gets the chance to be people in the same space. So we have to really seriously rethink how that works.
Yeah. I mean,
So
we're in this moment that feels like a kind of apocalyptic absolute, but I think we're the measure for the extent of this particular kind of pause on sociality, on the economy, on various things, really is the Spanish flu epidemic, you know, of 1918, 1919, you know,
and the Depression at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, well, you know, and then was, you know, kind of followed by, you know, one of the most socially vibrant periods in the nation's history. You know, what Prohibition spawned. You know what I mean, in terms of the jazz age and speakeasy. It was like people came out of that period of lockdown and, you know, couldn't stop, you know, finding ways to be next to each other and to sweat next to each other and dance next to each other and drink and so forth and so on. So, you know, this kind of pause is just a shock, you know, to our system of consumption, you know, of sociality. But there's nothing that says like this really is like the new normal forever. You know, it waits to be seen, you know, but some of it is so dependent on people kind of thinking about this lockdown not as something you're going to come out of after 60 days, but, you know, maybe 18 months, maybe 2 years. You know, it's just we haven't had to think about that kind of restriction on our notion of what this society is about.
Mm-hmm. You know, the hard part, though, is that it as traumatic and lethal as this all is, it's also an opportunity, right? In other words, this is a reflection of our society, and it's a mirror on the inequity that we've created. And if we saw this as a challenge, right? I mean, everybody in the whole planet is faced with this new pathogen. We all are challenged from the beginning in the same way. And so I think societies that see this as like, man, this thing is showing us who we are and we're going to fix it and come out of it better, are going to come out far ahead. And there are many historical correlates for that. I was reading this article by Amartya Sen, the economist, last week, and he was writing about the UK during the Second World War. They were getting the crap bombed out of them. It was a very traumatic time. Everybody was at risk, and what they decided was, instead of like getting all the rich people out of there, what they did is they gave access to food to everybody equally, and they created open access to healthcare for everybody. They were all under, blockade and stuff. And it turned out in the Second World War, under blockade, people's lifespans grew, right? And it also created the foundation for a nationalized healthcare system that helped them for the next 50 years. And so, it's an opportunity to build structures right now, even though it doesn't feel that way. And I feel like we risk, we have seen the devil, and it's us right now. And the thing is, this is a challenge for us to fix this stuff. And as a moment of opportunity to do that. And I think that's part of the challenge that good leadership would be promoting. It's not just how do we survive, but how do we actually build a better foundation?
Yeah, I mean, I think this future of the government system is something that's eventually going to come to a head. I mean, it may take a constitutional convention, but I think the concentration of power in one personality cult leader, whether it's on a state level or a national level, clearly is just keeps us on the brink of disaster. So I think it's, at some point, whether it's forced upon us or, we involve the intelligence to actually address the problematic, it's going to have to be dealt with.
Well, I think things like this only get changed when there's this big of a dramatic disruption. I mean, we've seen other disruptions and they haven't really managed to make systematic change. And now we have got a really such a serious problem that comes up at every level and every domain. Everything is affected. How do we then reconnect all of that in a way that makes more sense? Because so much of what we're dealing with, and you mentioned we hear about 1945 as such a disruption. Every one of those cities came back stronger, but it took them 50 years. And so you have to realize that.
There was something that kept coming up, and I want to direct this to Doctors Bishop and Metzel, respectively. Can we talk for one moment about education beyond screens and medicine beyond telemedicine? Because you can't have a discussion about either of those things in the future, foreseeable or not, without people saying, oh, telemedicine is going to be a thing, or this online education, when we're sitting in a city right now where there's a strict divide between people of color and others about whether they trust the administrations to fulfill either of those things. And there's a very real digital divide as well. So how do we address the digital divide in so many communities like Brooklyn with respect to seeing telemedicine coming down the road and this idea of online learning that's in our face now?
I think, Brian, it's again, we can't be categorical extremists. There's going to be more technology, but as Gregory has so well pointed out, people are just going to get together and they're going to start hugging each other after a while. And it means that we will have some of both. We won't have one. I'm proud to say that Cindy and I put the University of Houston master's degree online, the first degree at the University of Houston. It formed a cadre of people. You'd think online learning is all I'm going to do is talk to machines, and it's going to be dehumanized and it's going to be automated. Then, as a matter of fact, we've created a cohort of people over the last 20 years that have come together as alumni, as supporters of that program. So mediated communication is not necessarily machine communication. And I don't know whether, I'm sure the telemedicine is the same way. It's not the same as being together, but its reach and its accessibility is certainly a hell of a lot better than trying to have to be in the same place with other people.
It's trade-offs.
Well, I mean, for medicine, it's interesting. There are two tiers of that. I mean, in the immediate, right, I'm talking to my friends who are clinicians who are seeing people, and I'm asking them, like, what's changing in the practice of medicine right now, besides like everybody being terrified to go to the doctor and the doctor being terrified to go to work. And what they're saying is that in non-COVID cases, like they're having to learn to communicate with their eyes because it's just weird to have the patients and the doctors wearing masks. And so they're trying to form these new ways of, think about the core of medicine is not just the treatment, it's like the empathy, the understanding. And how do you do that if you're gowned up and all the person can see is like your eyebrows and stuff like that? And so they're trying to figure out new ways to communicate in a way that I think are going to be, hopefully, important and certainly urgent right now and lasting. And the other is actually a longer term issue, which is because so many people are afraid to go to the doctor right now, we're going to have to figure this out because it's not just COVID, right? All these kids are not getting vaccinated for, just everyday, chickenpox and measles and mumps and rubella and things like that. So all the things that we actually have cured by immunizations are going to start coming back because we're going to lose our herd immunity for other stuff. And so in a way, it really, there's got to be, even as everything is going toward COVID, there are urgent issues for medicine in terms of addressing just common everyday communicable diseases. And that again is going to have an issue of race and disparity and all the other issues.
So to finish out tonight, we got a question asking each of you from your respective field of endeavor to share one practical thing that folks might be able to do right now that would help them feel hopeful and empowered about making the future that we would all benefit from, that they'd like to see. So from a cultural standpoint and educational, the built environment and the way that we interact with it, and certainly a health perspective, is there one practical, maybe call to action that any of you see something coming down the pike or think that would hasten people right now as we are socially distant and globally minded?
I'll say there are two for me. One is elevate public health expertise. What we're seeing is that everything is not a medical problem. Public health is a science of communities. So let's make public health people like Dr. Fauci on down the experts we listen to because they're paying attention to communities. And the other part is don't take chloroquine unless you're.
We almost got through the program.
Sorry.
Very topical.
Yeah, from an education point of view, again, breaking down the walls of the schools and making it more of a community school again, I'd ask parents to talk to their kids. Make learning a family affair, not just what the kid's job is, but what are you learning? Can we do it together? Can we learn some things? Can we apply some things and do some practice? Parents are being forced into that. A lot of this, what Cindy says, is that this doesn't just give us the opportunity to be different. It requires us to be different. So what Heather said, all the adaptations we've already made, and here's an adaptation, talk to your kids. And if you don't have kids, go find yourself an educator. Talk to them online, talk to them in the park, talk to them on the phone. What is it like? What are you doing? And try to build more of a community around the schools, around the educational system, both within the family and within the community. I think those are practical things that people could use to try and accelerate the process of breaking down the walls and the differences between the education group and the community.
So Greg, as much as we have never seen this, in a lot of ways we've been here before. What can you tell people about preserving and pushing the culture forward at this moment?
I mean, I think we haven't addressed the degree to which people are really managing depression, like a sense of hopelessness, a sense of a certain kind of endlessness, a sense of isolation, alienation, and so forth. So I go back to DJ D Nice and what he's done with his club Quarantine, which now has this global audience. And if you want to feel just, in some ways, it's not even solely about the music he's playing, but I mean, it's certainly about the empathy and his degree of presence there, of like being able to like kind of recognize and acknowledge himself as having a purpose in this moment that people respond to, with their emojis and their messages and so forth. And it's like, that's going up the whole time he's playing. It's like, and people are shooting stars and virtual balloons off, you know what I mean? But I think for a lot of people have just said like that's one of the things that really kind of in terms of the cultural expression, like got them, kind of over the hump or got them, momentarily through all the kind of negative feelings that are kind of crowding in, at the same time, and then, there's other, Questlove of the Roots is also doing regular kind of club quarantine, and the group Black Girls Rock, and one of my favorites, Rich Medina, who kind of co-created the FAIA parties that were happening, that kind of brought together new communities, and that's the thing about dance music culture, since the 80s has really done that, and if you participated in it in the city, you knew that it was like available and open to all. You came in there and you just got your sweat on, so he's kind of carried this, these DJs are kind of carrying the spirit of being kind of messengers and avatars and griots of that movement into this digital realm, I think it's just a great model going forward in terms of how you bring the community in a real ecstatic sense, not just kind of a Zoom learning sense, into these platforms in this moment, in this isolation.
So Dr. Frewen, send us home with a reason to be hopeful in this concrete jungle.
The only time people innovate is when there's a disaster. You have to innovate. And so we have one, we have multiple layers of one. I mean, it has not even finished reaching its peak, I think, in terms of how bad it is. And so be ready for this longer term, but know that because of the disruption, everything is changing and you have a chance to make that change work for what you're interested in. What matters to you, these connections that we're talking about, the consequences of what we're doing now are going to last for a generation or more. And yet we're thinking, we're hooked on the day because the crisis is here, but people that are going to come out of this are going to shoot out of it. I mean, they're going to have something burning inside of them that they want to get done. And now they can get attention that they could never get before. And this is the time to do it. So think about that. And I think most importantly, get in touch with people that you know that are over 80, your family members, your neighborhood. These people are they are dying at a rapid rate with this pandemic. And now that we're going out into the world again, it's not going to be good for them. And so I have a lot of elderly people that are close and dear to me. And so I cherish every day that I have with them. And I think that's important to do too.
Don't wait to see what's going to happen, but head out, just like Cindy said, to create it, because the obstacles are dissolving. It's time to strike.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to call it there. You heard it. The obstacles are dissolving and it's time to strike. And we'll be there to share the stories as you make the world that we all want to see post this virus. Thank you for joining us again. Thank you for watching. And I can't wait to see each and every one of you in person so soon.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, thanks, Brian. Thank BRIC.
Yeah, next time in Brooklyn.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Take care, guys.
Peace out.
Bye.